want you to ask yourself where you yourself is. Right? So you think, where am I? I mean, we can start with who am I? You can start with who am I if you want, but say, where am I? And your answer probably is somewhere between the ears and from the heart north, right? So if you had to draw a box around your you, it would be something like that. That's a very peculiar answer to the question, but it's one that almost everyone in the modern West and almost everyone in Augustinian Christendom would have given. From the Romantic poets, to the Catholic mystics, to modern liberals, and even to certain kinds of modern postmoderns. It's a curious thing, an inwardness, an inner self that is who I really am. That my inner self is who I really am. If you pulled aside someone in Confucius China, or some of our ancestors outside of the Augustinian tradition, and asked, who are you, or where are you? The answer you would get would be decidedly external. I am the son of this person. I am a member of a community. I am, and the I, self, has an externality to it. We haven't lost externality, and in some ways we've become more materialistic. But ironically, the kind of materialism that's part of our present society is predicated on inwardness being the really real thing. Said differently, we cannot remove meaning from material unless what really matters is somewhere else. And that somewhere else for us is inside. I believe this is in part a heresy, even if it hasn't been called that, and that its fruits are manifested and finally over-ripening in our current soul state analogy that believes the real me, the real self, the real identity of the thing is somewhere hidden from view and only accessible to someone with secret knowledge. Said differently, Augustine's error comes to full fruit in Rousseau and finally enters politics and personal identity in the age following the Great Revolutions, the Great Revolutions, so the 19th century. That's a précis of what I argue, but what I'll speak about specifically are the values that are now attached to that inner self in its modern form, the values with which it understands itself, assesses the world, organizes things, understands virtues and vices, and so forth. So, the term values has a thinness that belies the importance of autonomy, equality, and consent to modern persons. More than functioning merely as values and a constellation of other possible values, they are transformed in the daily life of modern persons into dispositions, practices, law-like structures, and beliefs about proper and right behavior. They come to function as virtues, nomoi, first principles, and indeed dogmas. In this way, these core values provide the very contours of the world that modern persons inhabit, both collectively and individually. Since I do not have one perfect term for all that they are and do, values will serve as the catch-all term. And I will use the terms that seem most appropriate for the function of the value in each case. Sometimes it will be spoken of as a virtue, and other times as a practice or an assessment. Autonomy, consent, and equality illustrate for all attentive persons what it is like to be modern. They also direct action toward realizing the good with a capital G, namely the thriving of the modern person as an autonomous, consensual egalitarian. Thus, they function both as means and ends. Because of their range of usage, clear and stable definitions of these values are hard to come upon. But I'll pause here and offer very quick, back of the envelope definitions of them. Consent, which is more like consensualism in practice, teaches that some agreement of some kind needs to be given, preferably by clear external signs of the person concerned, before moral obligations are acquired. So that agreement is required prior to moral obligations. You cannot be born into a moral obligation. Thomas Hobbes told us this most directly and most clearly, told us what many of us already believed. He said, you are not morally obligated unless you have consented in some way. It can be tacit consent, implied consent, or active consent, but it's a form of consensualism. Contractarianism follows from this, as does a justification of the monopoly of violence in the state by the consent of the people. Secondly, equality. Equality as a value is the universally valid principle, and think here of principium, that there is nothing a priori setting one person over another. So no a priori distinction of one person over another. That is before we start interacting with one another. It's not a denial that difference can emerge, it's a denial of any a priori differences. And finally, autonomy, which is the most fraught. It's a good word because it means so much. Autonomy, as I'm describing it as a value, is that one should seek to be an end in oneself. It doesn't mean other people cannot also be considered as ends in themselves. In fact, that's one of the goals of this modern form of autonomy. We at least shouldn't harm others in their trying to be ends in themselves. But I am meant to make sure that I am an end in myself rather than a means to someone else's end. And the dichotomy here is the one between freedom and slavery. And again, Rousseau is perfect on this. He says, my will cannot be represented, right? No one else. And if I vote one day a year in the Republic, I'm a slave on the other 364 days of the year. Yeah? I am neither an end in myself personally, I'm submitted to others, and I am not ensuring that in the world of relations with others that I am insisting that I be treated as an end in myself. So we have consensualism, no moral obligations without prior agreement. We have equality, no a priori distinction. And we have autonomy, that I am to be treated and to treat myself as an end in myself. Because of their range of usage, clear and stable definitions of these values are hard to come upon. I gave brief ones. This is especially the case as some terms or concepts behind them are routinely invoked in ordinary personal interactions as well as in scholarly discourse. The range in use and meaning of, say, equality is both deep and wide. Yet these are values for persons, which introduces a further complication to defining them. The underlying theories of the self on offer are often both diverse and unclear. That holds whether the theory forms a sophisticated philosophical anthropology or is one of the mundane ideas of the self that are deployed in daily life. But omnis definitio est exclusio, and there's no way around it. So, nevertheless, the belief that we could somehow step outside of the stream of history and furnish a neutral definition of such words like libertas, freedom, autonomy, equality, consent, is an illusion well worth giving up. And for terms that are so normative, indeterminate, and as that same commentator I just paraphrased put it, so extensively implicated in the long history of ideological debate, the project of understanding them can only be one of trying to grasp the different roles they have played in our history and in our own place in that narrative. And one of my tasks in the project I'm busy with is to limit the definition to the uses of the terms as they're used by modern moral persons. So there's a phenomenological approach without submitting too much to phenomenology. What is it like to be a consensualist? What is it like to be an egalitarian? What is it like to be autonomous? From there, coming to a sense of what we denote by the term, and more importantly, what we connote by the term, all the other things that come along with it. And I think what comes along with it is that there's a new conscience. We still have the old consciences of history and tradition and religion and whatnot, but we get a new conscience. We get an alter conscience. It's a bit like learning to read. Once you learn to read, you cannot not read the stop sign. Yeah? I mean, I dare you to try not to read now that you know how. Once you get this alter conscience, which starts with the premise, the first value that enters is equality. Once you believe that no a priori distinctions are possible, you cannot unlearn it. You start to see divergences from it everywhere. And it has a logic in moral reasoning that starts to tell you, to whisper in your ear, that's unequal, therefore bad. It doesn't ask unequal in what sense, or in relation to which good. Yeah? This is the curious thing about the way equality functions. We don't want equality of anything bad in most cases, right? When we speak of it, it's spoken about as being manifestly good, but that's often because we fill in what comes in the genitive afterwards, right? We have equality of, and that X is some purported good. But we've truncated this such that the word itself becomes a stand-in for all kinds of goods. So not only do we have the belief that the distinction, a priori distinctions are to be avoided, or are wicked, we also understand that the thing itself, equality, is a good in itself, such that we don't need to talk about the things that would be equally distributed right? So it has a curious way of focusing the energy and the attention back onto itself and removing possibility for discussion about the things that would be distributed, or about the natures that we might assume to be present, which would be a fact that follows from which unequal relations, right? The movement here is always away from any fact establishing inequality of any kind or hierarchy of any kind. It pushes against that in principle. And the alter conscience is installed in you, and not only you, but corporate actors as well. If you think of modern republics, modern corporate persons, they will build themselves in such a way that indicates to us that they are committed to these principles, especially equality. And the less egalitarian they are, the more they will insist. So you have the Democratic People's Republic of Congo, yeah? Right? I mean, if it were a worse nation, it would have more words, yeah, that told you that it was really insistent on being a modern, self-sovereign end in itself, a republic, as we call it, yeah. Democratic, therefore we have equality there. Peoples has autonomy of some kind of either individual or corporate personality. Democratic People's Republic of Congo. Modern corporations also, in their statements of their corporate responsibility statements, will also put themselves, the more wicked they are, the more they will tell you how committed they are to these values and their practices. And the bigger the book will be about about discrimination and offenses against equality, right? So the worse they act in the world, the more committed they will be to these as values. Yeah. And now, this alter conscience is the personal aspect, but there's also then it's a conscience. It's only something that points to things and says, that's bad, don't do that, that's good, do that. But eventually it needs to manifest itself in something that can protect itself from itself, yeah? Equality, famously, if pursued on its own, is no respecter of persons. Think of the great regimes of the 20th century that committed themselves to equalitarian policies. A guillotine almost always follows, or a gulag, or a death camp, yeah? Even the weakest person who stands against the commitment publicly to a certain kind of equality can be disposed of for the purity of this value. And we recognize this. We recognize if we're only committed to the value of equality, everything else will be sacrificed. All of the goods that come after equality of justice, equality under the law, etc. If we're only committed to equality, we won't be able to have those goods because of the purity, the mathematical rigor of the value of equality. So we need to couch it in something or some other values that make it safe, right? It's like a medicine that needs to be put with neutral elements so that it can be processed through the digestive system. And autonomy and consent are the minimal requirements to save equality from itself and, truthfully, to produce a lot of good in the world. It can't be denied that certain aspects of egalitarianism have brought goods into the world that we all benefit from. That can't be denied. But equality on its own needs something that makes it a respecter of persons. It needs something that pushes it toward remembering that it is equality for human goods, not equality per se. And consensualism requires that he who will be subjected to the policy be asked in some way whether he agrees to it. So all modern regimes and all modern systems of moral philosophy and all modern theologies that put equality at the heart will quickly have consensualism added. But thirdly, we have a problem because many people will consent to all kinds of wickedness. Famously, Hugo de Groot, Grotius, the Dutch modern natural lawyer, allowed such liberty, such arbitrium liberum, that one could enslave oneself rather than die. Well, that's bad news if you want to protect the person, right? First, equality was going to kill us by its purity. Now consensualism is going to kill us by necessity or stupidity. We will consent to things that are outside of our interest. So the third thing that needs to be added is autonomy of some kind. A robust understanding of the dignity of the person. This works so long as the understanding of dignity is grounded in something more than individual persons. Now, I started with a heresy. I've called it a heresy, you can call it what you like, but I've started with what I've suggested. If it's not a heresy in itself, Augustine's invention of the inner self, then it has a tendency, it's a near occasions of heresy. What happens is, once we've individuated ourselves through equality, and we've had consensualism to save us from equality, we need to rely on autonomy. But we don't have a participation in a tradition that anchors this autonomy or this dignitas in some factual natural order. So we need to look for what could be the foundation of that autonomy. And what you find is, in John Stuart Mill, in Rousseau, in the whole modern discussion over what's called self-sovereignty, the grounding and anchor of the autonomy is within us, in that space. And the trick is, and this is trick in the good sense, the clue and the trick, is that only you know what's in there. And I have to ask you what's in there, and you tell me, and then we can organize our life together. What this means is two things. We are more different than we are alike. So the conclusion of inwardness is difference rather than likeness. This flips the traditional narrative on its head in the Christian idea of salvation that says we are more alike than different. Despite our differences, we can all be children of God. It flips this on its head. We are more different than alike. Rousseau famously said, "No one else has been made like me. I may not be better, but at least I'm different. I may not be better, but at least I'm different." So you have this knowledge of who you really are. And we each need to tell one another who we really are and come to some sort of contractual relation for what is possible, right? And from that, moral obligation, political obligation, and the rest follow. Now, this all works so long as who you really are is not, and who I really am, is not really wicked. Yeah? So long as there's no sin, this will work. The problem is, sin probably is as G.K. Chesterton said, the only one of Catholic moral dogmas that can be demonstrated empirically, right? So the problem is there is sin within us and within the structures. And so if we want to secure something like the rule of law, consistently making law in the world that can be followed by persons like you and me, we're going to have to say that that is impossible. It's impossible because there is no way to know in advance what the results of the contract will be. There isn't a nature that produces moral obligations prior to, right? There isn't an a priori. There's only an examination of what follows from the contract, what follows from the agreement of these. So something like the rule of law will have to be a byword for, as it is now in many public places, that which we currently find agreeable. And the we are those who are part of the contract. So I'll end on this. I testified in the Dutch Senate, in Hollandia, in the Dutch Senate, about rule of law in Poland and Hungary. Now, there were no Poles on the panel, and there were a few Hungarians. It was an odd testimony, but they wanted to say that Poland and Hungary didn't have the rule of law. I don't know whether that's true or not, but what I realized in the discussion was what was meant by rule of law was more or less what we, more or less now, understand to be acceptable and defensible legally, right? So the rule of law then becomes a byword for all kinds of other extensions of we consensual, autonomous egalitarians represented in national and international legislation. I've appealed to a new soul state analogy. I haven't said much about corporate personhood here, but I believe much of what I said can be applied to modern corporate persons. And there's a manuscript here that will become a book at some point. So I welcome you to read it when it comes out and tell me where I've missed the mark, and maybe during the question time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.